If you only have one source of income, you're more vulnerable than you think. Because right now, everything you earn depends on one system. And the moment that system stops, your income stops. That's not stability, that's risk. Pause for a second. Think about that. And most people don't realize it until it's too late. If you can make $1, you can multiply it, but most people never do. Right now, all of your income comes from one place, one system controlling everything you earn and how far you can go. And it feels normal. It feels stable. It even feels safe. But here's the truth. That one stream is also your biggest limitation. Because no matter how hard you work, no matter how many hours you put in, your income is capped. Your growth is capped. Your freedom is capped. And this is where it becomes dangerous, because most people don't even see it. They think the answer is to work more, and that belief keeps them stuck longer than they realize. And that's why they stay in the same place for years. Earn more, push harder, but that only stretches the same system. It doesn't change it. Let me show you something. Two people can earn the same income, start in the same position, and within a few years end up in completely different financial situations. Not because one works harder, but because one understands how to multiply income, while the other keeps trading time for it. Most people miss this. They focus on earning, but never learn how to expand. And that's why they stay dependent on one stream for far longer than they should. But here's what most people get wrong. They think building more income means starting from scratch. More work, more stress, more complexity. That's not how it works. Because what happens next is what changes everything. There's a way to take what you already earn and turn it into multiple streams without starting over, without guessing, and without relying on luck. And once you understand that process, you stop thinking like someone who earns money and start thinking like someone who multiplies it. And that shift changes your entire financial direction. So by the time you finish this, you'll see exactly how to take one income stream and expand it into 3 in a way that most people never even consider. And once you see it, you won't look at your income the same way again. Let's get into it. You've probably never thought about your income this way. Not in terms of structure, but in terms of dependence. Because from the beginning, you were taught one model. Work, earn, repeat. And as long as that cycle continues, everything feels fine. Bills get paid. Life moves forward. Nothing seems broken. But look closer. Everything you rely on is tied to one source. One stream that determines how much you can earn, how fast you can grow, and how much flexibility you actually have. Here's the truth. That's not control. That's limitation disguised as stability. Consider this. If your current income stayed exactly the same for the next 3 years, would your life really change? Would your situation improve in a meaningful way? Or would it just feel like more of the same? Most people don't ask that question because it forces a realization. The system they're operating in was never designed for expansion. It was designed for maintenance. And this is where it becomes dangerous, because the longer you stay in a system designed for maintenance, the harder it becomes to create growth. And this is exactly why most people never break out of it. Time gets tighter, energy gets divided, opportunities start to look risky instead of necessary. And gradually, without noticing, you begin to protect what you have instead of building what you need. Let me show you something. Every time you rely on a single stream, you are placing a ceiling on your progress. Not because you lack potential, but because your structure limits your output. Think about how income is created in that system. You give time, you get paid. You stop, income stops. You slow down, income slows down. So even if you improve, even if you become more efficient, you're still operating within the same boundaries. And that's the part most people miss. They improve their effort, but never change their structure, so the result stays the same. And over time, that creates a quiet frustration. Not loud, not obvious, but consistent. A feeling that something should be different, but isn't. And this is where the real shift begins. Because the moment you recognize that your income is limited, not by your ability, but by your structure, you start to see things differently. You start to question, what if I didn't rely on just one stream? What if I could expand what I already have instead of replacing it? And that question is where most people hesitate, because it sounds complicated. It sounds like more work. It sounds like starting over. But what happens next is where everything begins to change. Let me show you something. What I'm about to explain next is where most people get it wrong. Not because it's difficult, but because they're looking at income the wrong way. They think, to earn more, I need something new. A new job, a new idea, a completely different path. But that assumption is exactly what keeps them stuck. Because multiplying income doesn't start with something new. It starts with what already exists. And this is where the shift happens. Instead of asking, what else can I do to make money? You ask, how can I expand what I already do? That question alone opens a completely different direction. Because now you're not replacing your income, you're multiplying it. And once you understand this, everything becomes more efficient. Here's the framework, simple but powerful. One income becomes three through 3 layers. If you understand this structure, you'll never look at income the same way again. Core income, extension income, leverage income. Most people only operate in the first layer. They focus entirely on core income. That's the main source, the job, the primary activity, the place where time is exchanged for money. And while that works, it's also limited because it depends on your time, your presence, your continuous effort. So growth becomes linear. You work more, you earn more. You stop, income stops. That's the structure most people never question. Now here's where things begin to change. The second layer is extension income. This is where you take what you already do and expand it, not by starting over, but by building around it. Think about this. Every skill, every process, every task you perform has value beyond the place you use it. But most people contain that value. They use it once, in one place, for one outcome, and that's it. But what happens next is where opportunity appears. Because the moment you take that same skill and apply it differently, you create a second stream. And this is where most people miss their second income completely. Same foundation, different output. For example, if you have a skill, you can offer it directly. If you solve a problem, you can package that solution. If you've learned something, you can simplify it for someone else. This doesn't require starting over. It requires expanding what already exists. And this is where most people hesitate again, because they think, it's not enough. It's too simple. No one would pay for this. But that belief is what keeps the second stream from forming, because value doesn't need to be complex, it needs to be useful. And usefulness creates demand. Now we move into the third layer. And this is where multiplication happens. Leverage income. This is what people call passive income, but most people misunderstand it completely. And if you get this part wrong, you'll waste time chasing something that never works. This is where your effort is no longer tied directly to your time, where something you create once continues to produce results. And this is the layer most people skip completely, because it requires a different way of thinking. It requires patience. It requires consistency. But once it's in place, everything changes. Because now, you're no longer depending on one stream. You're operating with multiple flows. And those flows don't stop at the same time. One supports the other, one strengthens the other, and over time, they begin to grow together. Think about this clearly. Instead of one source of income, you now have one that you actively earn, one that you expand from what you already know, one that begins to work beyond your direct effort. And that combination is what creates stability. Because now, you're not relying on a single point. You're building a system. And systems scale. But here's the part most people still miss. Understanding this is not enough. Because what I'm about to show you next is the exact point where people fail, even after they know what to do.
Here's the truth. At this stage, information is no longer the barrier. You understand the structure. You can see how one stream becomes three. You know where it comes from and how it connects.
But this is where most people still don't move. Not because they can't, but because they don't shift how they think. And this is where it becomes dangerous. Because you can have the right framework and still stay in the same position. If your mindset stays tied to the old system, think about how most people approach income. They see money as something they earn, not something they expand. So even when they try to build more, they approach it the same way. More effort, more time, more pressure. And that leads right back to the same limitation. But what happens next is where everything changes. Because the moment you shift from earning to multiplying, your behavior starts to change automatically. You stop looking for extra work and start looking for expansion. You stop asking, what can I do next? And start asking, how can I use what I already have differently? That shift alone creates direction. Because now you're not starting from zero anymore. You're building from a base, and builders move differently. They don't wait for perfect conditions. They don't need complete certainty. They move with intention and adjust as they go. And this is where most people fall off again. Because this part requires consistency without immediate reward. It requires continuing, even when results are not obvious yet. And that's uncomfortable. So they slow down, they hesitate, they go back to what feels familiar. But those who continue begin to see something different. Not instantly, but gradually. A second stream starts forming, small but real. It might not replace anything yet, but it adds something. And that changes perception. Because now you're no longer operating from one source. You have options. And options change how you think. Think about this clearly. A few months pass. Nothing dramatic happens overnight, but something has shifted. You still have your primary income, but now there's another stream. It's not large, but it's consistent. It responds. It grows. And more importantly, you built it. That changes everything. Because now, you're not dependent in the same way. You're not limited in the same way. You're not thinking in the same way. And what happens next is where multiplication begins. Because once you build one extension, you understand the process. You see patterns. You recognize what works. And now, building the third stream becomes easier. Not because it's simple, but because you're no longer guessing. You're applying. And this is where everything starts to expand. Because now you're not relying on one source, you're operating with multiple flows, each one contributing, each one supporting the other. And over time, those streams begin to strengthen. What started as small additions becomes something significant. Now your income is not fixed. Now your growth is not capped. Now your effort compounds. And this is where control begins. Not theoretical control, real control. The ability to make decisions without being limited by a single source. The ability to move without being restricted by one system. And eventually, that leads to something most people never reach: leverage, stability, freedom. Not the kind that appears overnight, but the kind that builds quietly and becomes undeniable. And it all started from one shift. Not trying to earn more, but choosing to multiply what already exists. Take this in. Everything you've just seen only turns into results when it becomes action. Because most people will leave this video with new understanding, with better direction, with intention, and still return to the same routine. Nothing shifts. Not because the strategy was unclear, but because nothing was applied. So bring it back to yourself. Right now, what actually changes? Not later, not eventually. What begins from this moment? Because this is where direction is decided, and this is where hesitation usually shows up. I'll come back to this. I need to think it through more. I'll start when it feels right. But that delay is how people stay in the same place longer than they ever planned. So make it simple. Make it real. Go into the comments right now and type, "I build and expand." Not for motivation, for ownership. Because once you move forward, staying the same is no longer an option. And that's where everything begins. Your focus sharpens. Your standards rise. You stop observing from the outside and start executing with intention. Now understand this clearly. Even if you build multiple streams, you can still get this wrong. Because what most people believe about passive income is not how it actually works. And that belief alone causes people to waste time, chase the wrong opportunities, and expect results that never come. Which is why your next step matters. Watch this next video, because if you don't understand the truth about passive income, you'll build something that never grows. And that's exactly where most people get stuck. If your goal is real income, not short-term effort, then don't treat this like one video. Build this with me.
Subscribe to Financial Awaken with Aaron and turn on the notification bell, because this channel is designed to help you move from dependence to control through clear thinking and consistent execution. No distractions, no empty hype, just strategies that grow with you over time.